My own sister and uncle mocked my tiny apartment, treating me like the family failure. They thought they had finally broken my spirit, so I smiled, pulled out the keys to my new Lamborghini, and completely destroyed their false reality. Before we continue today's story, we have an urgent announcement to make. Due to technical issues, we are pivoting towards another channel. Please subscribe to our new channel, Inherited Revenge. You can find the link in the video description, the pinned comment, and the collaboration tag on this video. Make sure to switch over now so you don't miss out. Thank you for your support. Now back to the story. The persistent, rhythmic dripping of the leaky bathroom faucet had been the soundtrack to my misery for the past 3 days. I was 34 years old, but shivering under a thin, worn-out fleece blanket on my battered thrift store sofa, I felt ancient. A severe strain of the flu had knocked me entirely off my feet, leaving me with a fever that blurred the edges of my vision and a bone-deep ache that made merely breathing feel like an Olympic sport. My tiny, 400-square-foot apartment felt even more claustrophobic than usual. The single window in the living room looked out onto a brick wall, letting in only a gray, bruised-looking light that seemed to mirror exactly how I felt inside. I reached out with a trembling hand to grab the chipped ceramic mug resting on the wobbly coffee table. The tea had gone ice cold hours ago, but my throat was so raw I didn't care. As I brought the mug to my lips, my phone buzzed against the scuffed wood. The harsh vibration startled me, sending a jolt of pain through my temples. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping whoever it was would just leave a message and go away. But the buzzing persisted, vibrating twice, then 3 times in rapid succession. It wasn't a call, it was a series of audio messages. Reluctantly, I picked up the device. The screen brightness seared my tired eyes. It was a message from my mother, Claire. That was unusual. Mom rarely texted, and she almost never sent voice notes unless she was confused by the app's interface. Frowning, I tapped the play button on the first file and pressed the speaker to my ear, expecting to hear her asking how to turn off her tablet. Instead, I heard the unmistakable, booming, entirely too confident voice of my Uncle Arthur. "Claire, you have to look at the bigger picture here," Arthur's voice echoed through the tinny phone speaker. There was a faint background noise, the clinking of fine silverware and the soft hum of an upscale restaurant. "This house is sitting there, essentially dead equity. It's doing nothing for you. Meanwhile, Vanessa is on the verge of a massive breakthrough with her brand. She needs capital, real capital, not pennies." My breath hitched. They were talking about the family home. The home I had secretly spent the last 5 years paying the property taxes and maintenance on so Mom wouldn't lose it after Dad passed away. Then came my sister Vanessa's voice, smooth, rehearsed, and laced with that familiar tone of entitlement she had perfected since childhood. "Exactly, Mom. Think of it as an investment in our family's future. Uncle Arthur has the paperwork ready. It's just a simple home equity line of credit. We draw out the cash, I launch my lifestyle product line, Arthur manages the portfolio, and we pay the house off in a year. It's foolproof." There was a long pause. I strained to hear over the pounding in my own ears. Finally, Mom's voice came through, hesitant and weak. "But what about Sophia? Shouldn't we discuss this with her? She helps out sometimes. She might be upset if we leverage the house without telling her." Arthur's sharp bark of a laugh made me flinch. "Sophia? Claire, be serious. What does Sophia know about high-level financial leveraging? She lives in a shoebox apartment that smells like stale cabbage. She's a low-level data clerk who can barely keep her own head above water. If you tell her, she'll just panic because she doesn't understand money. She has no vision, Claire. She's content to struggle. You can't let her small-mindedness hold back Vanessa's potential." "He's right, Mom," Vanessa chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Sophia is sweet, but she's a failure. She's stuck. We're trying to elevate this family. Besides, it's your house. She has no claim to it. Let her stay in her little bubble. She doesn't need to know until we're millionaires and we buy her a nicer sweater for Christmas." Another pause. Then, the sound that shattered my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. "All right," Mom sighed, sounding relieved to have the decision taken out of her hands. "Pass me the pen, Arthur. Let's do this before I lose my nerve." The recording clicked off. It had been an accidental recording, likely triggered when Mom rummaged in her overly stuffed designer purse. She had inadvertently sent me the exact moment she signed away the only security she had left, completely erasing my years of silent sacrifice, all while allowing them to drag my name through the mud. The physical illness that had me bedridden suddenly felt entirely insignificant. The betrayal was worse than the fever burning through my veins. For a long time, I just sat there in the dim light of my apartment, the phone resting heavily in my lap. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt entirely numb, as if I had been submerged in a freezing lake. My own mother, my sister, my uncle. They had sat in some fancy bistro, sipping overpriced sparkling water, and casually agreed that I was nothing. A failure. A small-minded data clerk who deserved to be kept in the dark while they gambled away the family's last remaining asset. When the numbness finally began to recede, it was replaced by a slow, simmering anger that chased away my chills and brought a flush to my cheeks that had nothing to do with the flu. I needed to hear it from her. I needed to give her one chance, just one, to tell me the truth. I dialed Mom's number. It rang 4 times before she picked up. "Hello, sweetie," she answered. Her tone was light, airy, and entirely fabricated. It was the voice she used when she was trying to pretend everything was perfect. "How are you feeling? Did you drink that broth I told you about?" "I'm feeling a bit better, Mom," I lied, my voice tight and raspy. I stared at the peeling paint on the wall across from me, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "What are you up to today?" "Oh, just running errands," she said quickly, her voice pitching up a fraction of an octave. "Vanessa and I are just out and about. We had a lovely lunch with your Uncle Arthur." "Arthur," I repeated, letting the name hang in the air for a second. "That's nice. What were you all talking about?" There was a hesitation on the line, a sudden, heavy silence that spoke volumes. I could almost picture her looking nervously across the table at Arthur and Vanessa, silently asking them what to say. "Just family matters, Sophia," she finally replied, her tone shifting from airy to defensive in the blink of an eye. "Nothing for you to worry your pretty head about. You just focus on getting over that bug so you can get back to work. We know how much you need those hours at the office to make your rent." The sheer condescension in her voice, mimicking Arthur's earlier cruelty, was like a physical slap across the face. She was perfectly willing to adopt their narrative of me as the pathetic, struggling daughter if it meant avoiding conflict with them. "Right, my rent," I said quietly. "Mom, are you sure everything is okay? With the house, with the finances, you can always talk to me." "Everything is perfectly fine, Sophia," she snapped, suddenly irritated. The guilt was making her lash out. "Arthur is handling some restructuring for us. He's a professional. He understands things that you and I just don't have the background for. Honestly, you should be grateful he's stepping up to help us, considering how limited your own resources are." I closed my eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She had made her choice. She had aligned herself with the sharks, completely blind to the fact that she was the chum. "Okay, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, drained of all emotion. "If you say so, have a good afternoon." I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I tossed the device onto the sofa beside me and stood up. My legs were shaky, but the adrenaline coursing through my system was rapidly overriding the illness. I walked over to the small, rickety desk squeezed into the corner of my living room and opened my laptop. The screen glowed to life, illuminating my pale, drawn face. I didn't open a spreadsheet of data entry tasks. I didn't open a budget calculator to figure out how to afford groceries. Instead, I navigated to a secure banking portal. I typed in my complex password, answered the security questions, and watched as the dashboard loaded. There, staring back at me in stark, indisputable numbers, was an account balance that would make Uncle Arthur choke on his expensive cigars. 8 figures. The first installment from the quiet, highly confidential acquisition of the proprietary data analytics software I had spent the last 7 years building in this very apartment. They thought I was a failure because I didn't wear designer labels or lease cars I couldn't afford. They thought I was weak because I chose to live quietly rather than boast loudly. They thought they had entirely outsmarted me, but they had forgotten one crucial thing. You should never mistake silence for weakness, and you should never, ever assume you know the contents of a quiet person's bank account. To understand how my family reached this point of spectacular delusion, you have to understand the dynamic that shifted the day my father died. Dad H. Had been the anchor, a hardworking, pragmatic man who saw through nonsense and valued quiet diligence. When he suffered a massive heart attack 5 years ago, the foundation of our family cracked, and into those cracks seeped Uncle Arthur. Before Dad's passing, Arthur was just the loud, slightly embarrassing relative who showed up at Thanksgiving in a leased luxury sedan, wearing suits that were a little too shiny and a watch that was a little too big. He claimed to be a strategic wealth facilitator, a title that Dad always said was just a fancy way of saying he gambled with other people's money and took a cut before they realized they'd lost. Arthur had never offered to help pay for my college. He had never been around when Dad was in the hospital. But the moment the will was read, revealing that Dad had left the family home entirely to Mom free and clear, Arthur materialized like a vulture spotting a fresh meal. I remembered the exact dinner where Arthur first began his campaign. It was barely a month after the funeral. I was working 3 jobs, data entry by day, waitressing by night, and coding my software in the hours between sleep, just to ensure Mom had enough cash flow to cover the sudden influx of property taxes and maintenance bills she was wholly unprepared for. I was exhausted, wearing a faded sweater with a frayed cuff, quietly eating my salad. Arthur had arrived uninvited, carrying a bottle of expensive wine. He sat at the head of the table, Dad's chair, and immediately started holding court. "Claire, you look exhausted," Arthur had crooned, pouring her a large glass of wine. "You shouldn't be worrying about bills and ledgers at a time like this. You need someone to step in and manage this estate properly. There is so much locked-up potential here." I had spoken up, putting my fork down. "We're handling it, Arthur. The taxes are paid for the year, and I've set up a budget for the utilities. Mom doesn't need to worry." Arthur had turned his gaze to me, his smile not reaching his eyes. He looked me up and down, taking in my tired posture and cheap clothing. "Sophia, darling, it's adorable that you're trying to help. Truly, it is. But balancing a checkbook isn't the same as wealth management. What do you make at that little desk job of yours? 15, maybe $20 an hour? You can't even afford to live in a safe neighborhood. How can you possibly protect your mother's future?" Before I could respond, Vanessa had chimed in. She was 25 at the time, freshly graduated with a degree in communications, and fully convinced she was destined for stardom. "He's right, Sophia. You're always stressing about pennies. It's depressing. Uncle Arthur actually understands how money works. He knows people." I had looked to Mom, expecting her to defend me, to mention the thousands of dollars I had quietly transferred into her account just that morning. But Mom just looked down at her plate, intimidated by Arthur's booming confidence and Vanessa's sleek, polished agreement. "Arthur is just trying to look out for us, Sophia," Mom had murmured softly. That was the turning point. From that day on, Arthur became the family patriarch. He convinced Mom that she was fragile and incapable. He convinced Vanessa that she was a genius who just needed the right backing. And he systematically framed me as the pathetic, struggling sister whose advice was worthless because she had nothing to show for her life. I never corrected them. I let them believe I was broke because it was easier than fighting Arthur's ego, and because every ounce of my energy was going into building my company. I endured the snide remarks about my clothes. I sat silently through family gatherings while Arthur boasted about fictional successful trades and Vanessa showed off handbags that cost more than my monthly rent, secretly funded by Mom's dwindling savings. I sacrificed my own reputation in the family to keep the peace and protect my mother. But looking at my laptop screen now, listening to the echo of their cruel laughter on that voicemail, I realized that my sacrifice hadn't protected her at all. It had only emboldened a parasite. Arthur had finally made his play for the house, the biggest asset Mom had. He had manipulated her into signing a predatory loan, likely intending to siphon off the cash for himself under the guise of investing in Vanessa's non-existent business. They thought I was helpless to stop it. They were about to learn exactly how dangerous a quiet, calculating woman with unlimited resources could truly be. The moment I closed my laptop, the oppressive, stifling air of my small apartment seemed to shift. The fever that had been burning through my system broke, leaving behind a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I was no longer the exhausted, shivering woman huddled under a cheap blanket. I was the founder and former CEO of a data analytics firm that had just been acquired by a global conglomerate. I knew how. To trace digital footprints, I knew how to unearth buried truths. And most importantly, I had the resources to dismantle Uncle Arthur's carefully constructed illusion piece by piece. I picked up my phone, navigating past my mother's name and my contacts, and scrolled down to the letter M. I pressed the call button for Marcus Sterling, the lead corporate attorney who had navigated the labyrinthine legalities of my company's 8-figure acquisition. The line rang twice before his deep, resonant voice answered. "Sophia, I didn't expect to hear from you so soon after the closing. Tell me you're calling from a beach in the Maldives and not that dreary little apartment." "I'm still in the apartment, Marcus," I replied, my voice steady, the raspiness of my flu fading into the background. "And I need your help with something highly personal. It requires absolute discretion and extreme urgency." The conversational warmth instantly vanished from his tone, replaced by the sharp, focused attention of a legal shark smelling blood in the water. "Tell me exactly what you need." "I need a comprehensive background check and asset trace on an individual named Arthur Pendleton. He operates under a supposedly registered entity called Pendleton Strategic Wealth Facilitators. I need to know every LLC tied to his name, every filed tax return, every court record, and the current liquidity of his business accounts. Furthermore, I need to know if he has recently initiated a home equity line of credit application using my mother's property as collateral." I heard the rapid clicking of a high-end mechanical keyboard on Marcus's end. "Pendleton, got it. I have a team of forensic accountants who can tear his financial life down to the studs by tomorrow morning. But Sophia, if he's moving on a property deed, we have a very narrow window before the funds are dispersed. Do you want me to file an immediate injunction to freeze the asset?" "No," I said, a cold smile forming on my lips. "If we freeze it now, my mother will just view me as the villain who ruined my sister's big chance. Arthur will spin it to make himself look like a persecuted martyr. I don't just want to stop the transaction, Marcus. I want to expose exactly what he is, so undeniably that they can never defend him again. Let him build his house of cards as high as he wants. We are going to pull the bottom card out in front of everyone." "Understood," Marcus said. "I'll have the preliminary dossier sent to your encrypted server within the next 12 hours. Stay near your screen." I spent the rest of the night pacing the short length of my living room, drinking black tea and watching the clock. At exactly 6 in the morning, a notification chimed on my secure laptop. The file from Marcus was thick, terrifying, and utterly damning. As I scrolled through the pages of heavily redacted bank statements, civil court filings, and shell company registrations, the true scope of Arthur's deception became sickeningly clear. Pendleton Strategic Wealth Facilitators wasn't a wealth management firm. It was a hollow shell company with a registered address at a strip mall post office box. He had no active investment portfolio. His primary source of income appeared to be high-interest personal loans and, devastatingly, settlements from 2 previous elder fraud lawsuits that had been quietly swept under the rug out of court. And Vanessa's lifestyle brand? It consisted of a single registered domain name and an Instagram account with bot followers. There was no business plan, no supply chain, no manufacturer. Arthur wasn't securing a loan to fund her dream. He was using her vanity to trick my mother into handing over the equity of the only home she had ever known, entirely to pay off his own mounting legal debts. I possessed the key documents, I had the leverage. It was time to step out of the shadows. I didn't bother changing out of my simple, unassuming clothes, a pair of dark jeans and a plain gray sweater. They expected the struggling data clerk, and I was going to let them see her right up until the moment I shattered their reality. I drove my modest, 10-year-old sedan to the family home, the tires crunching against the familiar gravel driveway. Before I even reached the front door, I could hear the sound of clinking glasses and boisterous laughter echoing from the back patio. I walked around the side of the house, pushing open the wooden gate. The scene that greeted me was sickeningly festive. Uncle Arthur was leaning back in Dad's favorite wrought iron patio chair, a thick cigar clamped between his teeth, holding a glass of amber liquid. Vanessa was perched on the edge of a sun lounger, examining her manicured nails, while Mom hovered nervously near the patio table, arranging a plate of expensive imported cheeses. "Well, well, well," Arthur boomed, the moment he spotted me. His eyes raked over my simple outfit, his lips curling into a condescending smirk. "Look who decided to emerge from her little cave. Feeling better, Sophia? We didn't think you'd be able to afford the gas to drive all the way out here." Vanessa didn't even look up from her nails. "Honestly, Sophia, you shouldn't be out if you're contagious. I have a very important networking event tomorrow, and I cannot afford to look puffy." Mom wrung her hands together, a forced, tight smile stretching across her face. "Sophia, sweetie, what a surprise, we were just having a little celebration." "I know exactly what you're celebrating," I said, my voice cutting through the humid afternoon air like a blade. I didn't raise my volume, but the absolute icy calm in my tone made all three of them freeze. I walked slowly onto the patio, stopping a few feet from Arthur's chair. "You're celebrating the successful manipulation of a grieving widow. You're celebrating the fact that you, Arthur, just coerced Mom into signing a home equity line of credit to the tune of $300,000, effectively mortgaging her future to fund your delusions." The silence that followed was absolute. A bird chirped loudly in the oak tree above, amplifying the sudden, tense quiet. Arthur's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He pulled the cigar from his mouth, his fake joviality evaporating instantly. "How dare you?" he hissed, leaning forward. "You have been snooping in family business that does not concern you. You are a paranoid, jealous little girl who cannot stand to see her sister succeed." "Succeed at what, Vanessa?" I asked, turning my gaze to my sister. Her mouth was slightly open in shock. "I've seen the registration for your so-called business. You have 0 registered trademarks. You have 0 vendor contracts. Your business model is nothing but a mood board on a laptop. If Arthur hands you any of that money, it will be gone in 6 months on designer shoes and luxury vacations." "You're just jealous," Vanessa screeched, standing up so fast she knocked over her glass of sparkling water. "You've always been jealous of me. Uncle Arthur is a professional. He knows what he's doing." "A professional?" I laughed, a short, humorless sound. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of paper. I tossed it onto the glass patio table, right on top of the imported cheese. "That is the corporate registration for Pendleton Strategic Wealth Facilitators. Your firm, Arthur, is registered to a P.O. box next to a laundromat. You hold 0 active investment licenses in this state. You aren't a wealth facilitator. You're a con artist." Mom gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Sophia, stop it. Arthur is family. You can't say these terrible things." Arthur stood up, towering over me, his fists clenched at his sides. The mask of the benevolent patriarch had entirely slipped, revealing the desperate, cornered bully underneath. "You listen to me, you pathetic little failure," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You know nothing about the financial sector. I am trying to save this family from the mediocrity you wallow in. If you ever speak to me like this again, I will ensure you are entirely cut off from this family. Do you understand me?" "You will have nothing." I looked him dead in the eye, not backing down an inch. You can't cut me off from something I walked away from years ago, Arthur. And as for having nothing, you have no idea what I have." I turned on my heel and walked back toward the gate, leaving the toxic silence hanging heavily over the patio. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for them to desperately try and spring it. The fallout from the patio confrontation was immediate and chaotic. For the next 3 days, my phone blew up with furious, poorly spelled text messages from Vanessa, accusing me of trying to sabotage her entire future out of pure spite. Arthur, conversely, went entirely silent toward me, which told me he was panicking. He was undoubtedly pushing Mom to expedite the bank transfer before I could somehow interfere, operating under the desperate delusion that if the money was in his account, he would be untouchable. Meanwhile, my own investigation was reaching its devastating conclusion. I sat at my desk, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, as Marcus and I went over the final, irrefutable pieces of the puzzle. "We found the smoking gun, Sophia," Marcus said over the speakerphone, his voice grave. "It took some digging through sealed civil dockets in the next county over, but we found it. 4 years ago, Arthur Pendleton was formally investigated for defrauding an elderly couple out of their retirement savings using an almost identical home equity scheme. They settled out of court with a strict non-disclosure agreement, which drained whatever legitimate funds Arthur had left. He's been floating on credit and shell games ever since. Send me the docket numbers and the redacted settlement agreement," I instructed, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rye. THM against my ribs. I need the physical proof in my hands. "Sending it now," Marcus replied. "Sophia, if your mother signs the final authorization to release those funds to his LLC, that money is gone. He will wire it offshore faster than we can blink." "She won't sign it," I said, a fierce, protective determination hardening my voice, "because I'm going to show her exactly who she's dealing with." Barely an hour after, I printed the thick stack of damning legal documents. A frantic knocking echoed on my apartment door. I opened it to find Mom standing in the dim hallway, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen her. She was trembling, clutching her designer purse to her chest like a shield. "Mom," I said softly, stepping aside to let her in. She walked into my cramped living room, looking around at the worn furniture and the faded walls as if seeing them for the first time. "Arthur said," she started, her voice breaking. "Arthur said you threatened him. He said you're mentally unwell, Sophia. He said you're trying to destroy the family because you're unhappy with your own life. He wants me to sign the final bank release this afternoon. He says if we wait, the market window will close and Vanessa's business will fail." I gently placed my hands on her shoulders and guided her to the battered sofa. "Sit down, Mom, please." She sank into the cushions, tears brimming in her eyes. "Why are you doing this, Sophia? Why can't you just let us have this one good thing? You've always been so independent, so distant. Why do you suddenly care about the house?" "Because it's your home, Mom," I said, sitting on the coffee table directly in front of her, forcing her to look into my eyes. "And because I have never been distant. I have been working. Quietly. I never told you because I knew if Arthur found out I had money, he would never stop hunting it. And he would use you to get to it." Mom blinked, confused. "Money? Sophia, you live in a tiny apartment. You work a data entry job." "I quit that job 5 years ago, Mom," I said gently. "I spent the last 5 years building a software company right here at this desk. I just sold it." Before she could process that massive paradigm shift, I reached onto the desk and picked up the thick manila folder containing the legal documents Marcus had sent. I placed it in her trembling hands. "I don't care if you don't believe me about my own life right now," I told her, my voice firm and unwavering. "But you have to believe this. Open it. Read the first page. It's a court settlement, Mom. 4 years ago, Arthur tricked another family into doing exactly what you're doing right now. He stole their retirement. He is entirely broke, and he is using Vanessa's vanity to steal your house so he doesn't go to prison for his other debts." Mom looked down at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. Slowly, with shaking fingers, She opened the cover. I sat in silence as she read the dense legal text, watching as her eyes darted back and forth across the page. I watched the exact moment her loyalty shattered. Her breath hitched, a small, wounded sound escaping her throat as she saw Arthur's signature at the bottom of a confession of financial liability. "Oh my God," she whispered, the papers slipping from her grasp and scattering across the worn rug. He promised me. He said he was protecting us." "He was hunting you," I corrected softly. Mom buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet, devastating sobs. She was finally broken free from his spell, the terrible reality of her near ruin crashing down upon her. I moved from the table and sat beside her on the sofa, wrapping my arms around her. "It's okay," I murmured into her hair. "You didn't sign the final release. We still have the house. And tomorrow night, at the big family dinner Arthur planned to celebrate his victory, we are going to make sure he never attempts to manipulate this family ever again." The reservation was under Arthur's name at Le Petit Chateau, arguably the most pretentious, outrageously expensive French restaurant in the downtown financial district. It was the exact kind of place Arthur favored, a dimly lit, velvet-draped establishment where the menus had no prices and the waiters spoke in hushed, reverent whispers. He had chosen it intentionally, a grand stage to celebrate what he believed was his ultimate victory. The final signing of the paperwork that would drain my mother's home equity into his fraudulent accounts. I arrived precisely 10 minutes late. I didn't bother to dress up for the occasion. I wore the same dark jeans, a simple white blouse, and a plain black blazer. As I walked through the heavy, brass-studded oak doors, the maitre d' took one look at my sensible, scuffed loafers and visibly hesitated before leading me to the private dining alcove Arthur had reserved. As I approached the table, the scene was a grotesque tableau of unearned triumph. Arthur W. As seated at the head of the heavy mahogany table, an oversized crystal glass of deep red wine resting in his thick hand. He was wearing a new, loudly patterned silk tie and a smug expression that made my stomach churn. Vanessa sat to his right, wearing a shimmering cocktail dress that undoubtedly cost more than my monthly grocery budget, furiously typing on her phone, entirely absorbed in her own manufactured reality. And then there was Mom, sitting to Arthur's left. To the casual observer, she might have looked merely tired, but I knew her tells. I saw the rigid stiffness of her spine, the pale, almost translucent quality of her skin, and the way her hands were tightly clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. She looked up as I approached, her eyes meeting mine. In that brief, silent exchange, an entire conversation occurred. She was terrified, but beneath the fear, I saw the hard, unyielding spark of a woman who had finally woken up. We had a plan. Well, Arthur boomed, his voice deliberately loud enough to carry past the heavy velvet curtains of our alcove. He gestured expansively with his wine glass, spilling a drop onto the crisp white linen tablecloth. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence. I was beginning to think your little car had broken down on the way from the slums." I pulled out my chair slowly and sat down, carefully placing my worn leather handbag on the floor. I folded my hands on the table and looked at him calmly. "My car is running perfectly fine, Arthur. Thank you for your concern." Vanessa finally looked up from her screen, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Honestly, Sophia, you couldn't have dressed up? Just a little? This is a celebratory dinner. Uncle Arthur is finalizing the capital for my brand launch tomorrow morning. We're celebrating our future. You look like you're about to ask us for a loan." Arthur chuckled, a wet, patronizing sound that grated against my nerves. He leaned forward, resting his heavy elbows on the table, invading my space. "Speaking of loans, Sophia, how are things over in your neck of the woods? Still living in that tiny apartment?" He laughed again, louder this time. "I imagine the rent is getting steep for a mere data clerk, especially with inflation." Vanessa scoffed, taking a delicate sip of her sparkling water. She sneered, her lip curling in genuine distaste. "Must be tough. Honestly, I don't know how you can stand waking up in that depressing little box every day. It's just so stagnant. You have no ambition, Sophia. It's sad. I didn't flush. I didn't look away. I didn't display a single ounce of the shame they were so desperately trying to force upon me. Instead, I reached slowly into the deep pocket of my black blazer. My fingers closed around the smooth, heavy weight of the small, metallic object resting there. I pulled my hand out and placed the object directly onto the pristine white tablecloth, right next to my empty water glass. The heavy, polished metal caught the dim, ambient light of the crystal chandelier overhead. The distinctive, aggressive shield logo, a golden bull ready to charge, was unmistakable. Mom, who had been sitting in agonizing silence, perfectly playing her part in our orchestrated play, leaned forward. She looked down at the table, her eyes widening in perfectly executed, albeit entirely genuine, astonishment. "Wait," she breathed, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet alcove. Is that a Lamborghini fob?" Vanessa stopped mid-sip, her glass hovering inches from her mouth. Her eyes snapped from my face to the table, her brow furrowing in deep, painful confusion. I smiled. It wasn't a defensive, timid smile. It was a slow, predatory grin that stretched across my face, fueled by 5 years of suppressed anger and silent, grueling labor. I reached out and tapped the heavy fob with one fingernail. "Oh, this," I grinned, locking eyes with Arthur, watching the smugness begin to curdle on his face. "Just a little housewarming gift to myself." Arthur froze. The color began to drain from his face, replaced by an ashen, sickly pallor. What kind of joke is this?" he sputtered, his booming voice suddenly sounding thin and reedy. "Did you buy a fake keychain online to try and impress us? Because it's pathetic, Sophia, truly." "It's not a joke, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous timbre. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. I slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of his plate. "And the housewarming gift isn't for the apartment, it's for the new property. A 12-acre estate in the Northern Hills. 6 bedrooms, a private lake, and a climate-controlled garage for the new car. I closed on it yesterday morning. Paid in full. Cash." Vanessa dropped her phone. It clattered loudly against the fine china plate, but she didn't even flinch. "Cash?" she whispered, staring at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. "WH. Are you talking about? You do data entry." "I did data entry," I corrected her, never breaking eye contact with Arthur. "To pay Mom's property taxes because Arthur refused to help when Dad died. But in my spare time, I built a predictive data analytics software firm. A firm that I just sold to a global conglomerate for an 8-figure sum. I don't live in a tiny apartment because I'm a failure, Vanessa. I live there because I don't need to wear my wealth to know my worth, unlike some people at this table." Arthur's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled onto the deck of a boat. His mind was furiously trying to compute this impossible reality, trying to find an angle, a way to spin this massive revelation into an advantage for himself. "Sophia," he finally gasped, trying to force a sickly, desperate smile onto his face. This is incredible news. Why didn't you tell your family? With this kind of capital, my firm could." "Your firm," Mom suddenly interrupted. The entire table went dead silent. Mom had never in 5 years raised her voice to Arthur. She had never interrupted him. She sat up entirely straight, pushing her chair back slightly from the table. The trembling fear was entirely gone from her posture, replaced by a cold, magnificent fury. She reached into her own handbag and pulled out the thick manila folder I had given her the night before. She didn't slide it across the table. She slammed it down onto the mahogany wood with a force that made the silverware jump and the crystal wine glasses ring. "Your firm, Arthur, is a post office box next to a laundromat," Mom stated, her voice trembling not with fear, but with absolute, unrestrained rage. "Your firm is a front for a man who preys on grieving widows. A man who was sued 4 years ago for defrauding an elderly couple out of their retirement savings using the exact same home equity scheme you tried to pull on me." Arthur recoiled as if he had been physically struck. "Claire, who told you?" "Read it, Vanessa," Mom commanded, ignoring Arthur entirely and pointing a shaking finger at the manila folder. Read the court documents. Read how your beloved, professional uncle settled out of court and admitted to financial liability. He has no money. He has no licenses. He was going to use my house to pay off his own mounting legal debts, and he was going to leave us completely destitute. Vanessa looked at the folder, then at Arthur, panic rising in her chest. Uncle Arthur, is this true? What about my launch capital? Arthur stood up so violently his chair tipped backward, crashing onto the carpeted floor. Several patrons in the main dining room turned their heads, peering through the curtains at the commotion. His face was a mask of pure, cornered panic. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at me. You stole those documents? This is slander. I will sue you for everything you have. I will ruin you. You can't ruin me, Arthur, I said calmly, leaning back in my chair. Because my lawyers are already 10 steps ahead of you. The documents are public record if you know which county dockets to unseal. And furthermore, I've already forwarded a comprehensive file of your current banking activities, including your fraudulent application for Mom's loan, to the State Financial Regulatory Board. They are very interested in your strategic wealth operations. Mom stood up, her eyes blazing. She looked at Arthur not as a patriarch, but as a pathetic, shrinking parasite. You are never to contact me again, Arthur. You are dead to me, and if you ever try to come near my home, Sophia's lawyers will ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal penitentiary. She turned to Vanessa, who was openly weeping now, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks, her illusions of unearned grandeur shattered into a million pieces. And you, Mom said, her voice softer but incredibly firm. You need to wake up, Vanessa. The free ride is over. You are going to get a real job, and you are going to learn how to support yourself. I am done funding your vanity at the expense of my sanity. Mom picked up her purse and turned her back on Arthur, extending a hand toward me. Come on, Sophia. The air in here is suddenly very stale. I stood up, leaving the empty, overpriced menu on the table. I picked up the Lamborghini fob, the heavy metal cold and satisfying in my palm, and walked out of the alcove with my mother, leaving Arthur sputtering helplessly among the ruins of his own grand deception. The crisp evening air hit us the moment we stepped out of the heavy restaurant doors. I handed the black fob to the stunned valet, who took one look at my sensible loafers and then down at the Raging Bull logo, his eyes widening to the size of saucers. Within minutes, the low, thunderous roar of a V10 engine echoed through the stone courtyard. When the matte black Lamborghini Huracan pulled up, idling with a menacing me. Chanical purr, Mom actually laughed, a bright, clear sound I hadn't heard in 5 long years. I opened the passenger door for her, helping her sink into the low, incredibly crafted leather seat. I slid behind the wheel, the dashboard illuminating like the cockpit of a fighter jet. As we pulled away from the curb, leaving the restaurant and the toxic remnants of our family behind in the rearview mirror, the silence in the cabin was profoundly different from the silence in my tiny apartment. It wasn't oppressive. It was expansive, full of unspoken relief and the thrilling promise of a future completely unburdened. The fallout over the next few weeks was swift and entirely merciless. Marcus Sterling, true to his word, had coordinated the release of our findings with absolute, surgical precision. Arthur's panicked attempt to secure a quick loan from a shady, high-interest lender to cover his tracks backfired spectacularly when the state regulatory board froze all accounts tied to his name and his fictitious LLC. 2 days after the dinner, he was formally served with a mountain of legal injunctions that completely paralyzed him. He was forced to sell his leased luxury car and quietly vacate his high-rise apartment, disappearing into the woodwork to avoid the impending criminal fraud charges Marcus was actively helping the authorities build. Vanessa, stripped of her enabler and her primary source of unearned income, had a spectacular, highly public meltdown on her social media accounts, claiming she was a victim of a toxic family conspiracy. When her remaining credit cards were declined, reality finally crashed down upon her. The last I heard from a mutual acquaintance, she had quietly deleted her lifestyle brand page and taken a job as a receptionist at a dental clinic just to make her rent. Mom held firm to her boundary. She refused to take Vanessa's calls until she proved she could hold down a job for 6 consecutive months. It was tough love, but it was the only kind of love that could save my sister from herself. As for me, I finally packed up the tiny 400-square-foot apartment. I stood in the empty space one last time, looking at the faded spot on the wall where my desk used to sit. I didn't feel nostalgic, but I did feel a deep sense of respect for the woman who had lived there. She had endured the cold, the sickness, and the agonizing cruelty of her family, all while quietly building an empire in the shadows. The new estate was everything I had promised and more. It sat at the end of a long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees, entirely hidden from the main road. The house itself was a sprawling, modern masterpiece of glass and stone, overlooking a private, glittering lake. A month after the dinner, I invited Mom over for her first official visit. We sat on the massive, sweeping terrace overlooking the water, wrapped in thick cashmere blankets, holding mugs of expensive, perfectly steeped tea. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and purple. Mom looked out over the property, a look of profound peace settling over her features. She turned to me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am so incredibly sorry, Sophia," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I was so blind. I let him make you the villain. I let him tell me you were broken, when all along you were the only one holding this entire family together. I don't know how you can ever forgive me." I reached over and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "There's nothing to forgive, Mom. Arthur was a professional predator. He found our weak spot when Dad died, and he exploited it perfectly. You were grieving, and he offered you an illusion of safety. Anyone would have wanted to believe him. But you didn't," she pointed out softly. "You saw through him from the very first day." "I saw through him," I agreed, taking a sip of my tea. "But I also knew that if I fought him without absolute, irrefutable proof, he would just manipulate you into cutting me off. I had to wait. I had to build my own armor and my own weapons before I could go to war for you." Mom leaned her head against my shoulder, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. "Well," she murmured, looking down at the heavy, intricate stone patio beneath our feet, "you certainly won the war. I've never felt so safe in my entire life." I smiled, looking out at the calm, mirror-like surface of the lake. The leaking faucet was gone. The cramped walls were gone. The constant, gnawing anxiety of protecting my mother from a monster in a tailored suit was finally extinguished. I had played the long game, enduring years of mockery and deliberate underestimation, entirely secure in the knowledge of what I was building in the dark. They had laughed at my tiny apartment. They had sneered at my worn-out clothes. They had genuinely believed I was the tragedy of the family. But as I sat on the terrace of my multi-million-dollar estate, listening to the quiet, soothing sounds of the surrounding forest, I knew the absolute truth. I wasn't a tragedy. I was the architect of my own justice, and I had built it flawlessly.